Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Monday evening Introduction to Philosophy and Theory live stream lecture. My name is Julian, and if you're new here, this is a weekly live stream lecture that I've been hosting for the past 3 years where I try to introduce some of the key ideas in philosophy, theory, literature, art, what have you. Essentially, this is supposed to be a 45-minute lecture where I try to essentially share a communal space where we're enthusiastic about philosophy and theory and learning. And I already see some people joining us in the comments. Please do drop a comment letting me know where you're joining us from. Always makes me very happy to know that we are joined by people from around the world. I'm currently in Hamburg, Germany, having a wonderful time here. But please do drop a comment. I see Croatia. Hello, Croatia. If you're curious what we're going to be talking about today, we're going to be talking, first of all, about Stefan Zweig's novel Marie Antoinette. I'm going to use that to broach Marx's critique, or Marx's analysis, if you will, of the French Revolution, and specifically the relationship between the Royalists and the Republicans. This is going to relate them back to Hegel's theory of history. I'd also like to talk about the commodity fetish, Lacan's theory of the master signifier, and how he relates it to Racine's argument about fearing God and therefore having no other fears. And finally, if we have time, I'd like to talk a little bit about two things that I've watched recently, one being David Fincher's film The Killer, and the other one being a documentary on Netflix about the heiress of the L'Oreal company, which I'll try to tie in together. All that and more in the next 45 minutes or so. And these lectures are entirely open access and free, so please do feel free to stick around. I see people from Australia, Canada, Palestine. That's incredible. Hello, hope you're well. Singapore. And if you'd like to join our learning community behind the scenes, I highly encourage you to check out the Patreon, where I post all of my lectures, as well as my ebooks and other community features like a podcast and transcripts. So if you'd like to become a patron and help me keep hosting these sessions, please go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy, or simply click the link in my bio. Okay, let's dive right in. First of all, thank you so much for being here. It really means a lot. I love that we can share this space together. It's really quite wonderful. I look forward to this every week. It's a nice way to start my week, and I hope it is for you as well. So I'd like to start with something that Karl Marx actually observes in his analysis of the French Revolution. And I should begin by saying that I have not yet seen the new Ridley Scott biopic of Napoleon. I'll try to see it this week. I'm sure that this would relate to the Napoleon film as well. But Marx has an interesting observation about the revolution. At a certain point, he says that what's interesting is that the revolution wasn't really about the royalists versus the republicans. It wasn't simply two opposing viewpoints. In a sense, the revolution was very much incremental, and in part it was a royalist project, if you will, that the royalist factions in the National Assembly were a key component of what led to the revolution. In fact, it wasn't so much that with the storming of the Bastille we immediately had the ushering in of a new era. There was a very long interregnum in which the king and the queen, Marie Antoinette, were essentially kept in the palace, and not only kept in the palace, but they were still adhered to as a kind of as a royal family, even though they were not, strictly speaking, as powerful as they had once been. And it's a very interesting thing, because Stefan Zweig actually writes about this in his biography of Marie Antoinette, that strictly speaking, for a long time, the royalty, the monarch, continued to function as a kind of living dead monarch, a monarch in name only, so to speak. That they were ensconced within their palace, they'd been forced to move from Versailles back to Paris, and that even though the Republican majority had taken hold of the National Assembly and of the country, and were therefore anti-royal, that nevertheless the royals were still treated like royals. In other words, if they would appear in public, they would be heralded as, long live the king and long live the queen, etc. That the very revolutionary sentiment for a brief period of time seemed to coexist with that which it was antithetical to, which was the monarchy. And so Marx is interested in this idea of how can the two coexist? How can it be that we have revolutionary Republican sentiment who nevertheless uphold the idea of the monarchy? And the key thing here is that the monarch and the monarchy was essentially the master signifier. It's that the French national identity could only envision itself as being the subjects of the king. However, the key revolutionary, if you will, insight of the National Assembly was to say that the destiny of the nation was now in the hands of the people, and that therefore it had to be legitimized by the king. In other words, that the king himself was the guarantor of the Republican Revolution, which is very different from how we see it today as being antithetical to the revolution as such. Now, what this means is that there's some beautifully ironic scenes in this book where essentially we have the very people who are plotting the end of the monarchy who nevertheless find themselves enthralled by it. And we have earnest royalists who nevertheless participate in the National Assembly in a way that undermines the monarchy. Now, I want to go back to the idea of the master signifier here, which is key. Because if you think about it, the master signifier for the French society as it existed back then was guaranteed by the monarch. The monarch was the figurehead. In fact, there's a beautiful passage where the king and queen make an escape out of Paris, and it takes a while for people to realize that they are in fact the king and queen because they've never seen them in person. They've only ever seen their profiles on the coins. And this means that the only way in which the new Republican identity could be formed was for it to temporarily exist under the auspices of this master signifier, of the monarch. Hence, the problem that arises is that the monarch existed in name only, that the king was essentially expected to reside in his palace and to allow for the gradual undermining of the monarchy, to essentially give it his blessing. And this is why it's so key that the monarch wasn't allowed to leave Paris. That, in a sense, he was living in a gilded cage within his palace in Paris. That as soon as he went out, as soon as he went into the country, or even potentially fled the country, he would therefore essentially delegitimize the identity of the Republican project in itself. And again, this is the historical irony that the Republicanism wasn't simply antithetical to royalism, is that it saw itself as the historical necessity of the liberation of the people, which had therefore to be guaranteed and upheld by the master signifier of the monarch. Of course, eventually, spoilers for history, this means that the monarch has to be done away with as well, and Marie Antoinette with as well. And in fact, you could even argue that the revolutionary terror was necessary to move away from the master signifier of the monarchy, to create, if you will, a Hegelian night of the world, a kind of ultimate negativity, or a site of radical negativity in which all symbols lost their meaning, in which you had a kind of clean slate from which a new political project could be made and generated. Now, what's interesting about this is this idea of the royalists versus the Republicans is something that Marx then relates to the commodity fetish and to fetishism. Because in a strictly feudal society, for Marx, of course, this is the key, the transition from feudalism to capitalism eventually. In a feudal society, you have social relations of domination. In other words, domination between people, between hierarchies, between classes. You have the king, and then you have his courtesans, you have his aristocrats who keep the court. And the entire hierarchy is about who is recognized by the king. For example, if the king doesn't deign to speak with you, then even if you're at the court, you strictly speaking don't exist. You're not a part of the existing social order. And of course, the people, and within the feudal system, those working the fields don't exist in the first place. They're essentially dehumanized. They're not considered even real people worth thinking about. And so what happens within a feudal society is that the system of social relations revolve entirely around this domination, about who's on top and who's on the bottom. And that therefore to be on top gives you the ultimate right to rule, that your legitimacy exists in a kind of paradox or like a spiral, which is that you're legitimized because you're on top, and you're on top because supposedly this is a sign of your legitimacy. Hence, also it being a reflection of the idea of a divine order where the king was supposed to be the representative of God on earth, the embodiment of divine will and authority, and that therefore the feudal system was cast as the most innately natural representation of divine order and will. What happens from Marx in the transition from feudalism to capitalism is that the system of social relations and social domination isn't something that disappears. Instead, it becomes repressed. In the transition from an aristocratically dominated society towards a bourgeois society, this oppression that exists between social relations is simply repressed. And the manner in which it is repressed is that all subjects consider themselves to be free. In other words, no one is oppressed by anything. No one is made unfree by anyone. To put it a little bit cynically, essentially, domination becomes outsourced to the population, who now have to make themselves unfree to work hard and to become reliable workers who, to put it in contemporary terms, are those who show up first to the office and are the last to leave. In other words, an entire moral system, an ideological system, if you will, which Marx characterizes as bourgeois or mercantile, emerges to essentially repress or mask the continued existence of the social oppression within social relations. But now it is given to you as being your own destiny, that you are free, that anybody could make anything out of themselves, etc. Of course, from a contemporary perspective, you will recognize this in the so-called American dream. The American dream being the notion that anyone can come to the United States and essentially have a rags to riches ascension story, this fantasy about the melting pot, so to speak. And while certainly there are examples of this being true, fundamentally the ideology of the American dream is precisely that therefore the responsibility for your ascension is put solely upon yourself. It's an individualizing process which is supposed to work, if not in a meritocratic fashion, then at least on some kind of level playing field in which your efforts will be duly rewarded and sacrifice and struggle become the central components of your own value system and worth. That the more you're willing to hustle and grind, if you will, for your success, the more deserving you are of it. Now, Marx's argument, therefore, is to essentially say that the same system of oppression that existed within a feudal society, within, for example, the court, the aristocracy, is simply transposed onto liberal democracy, onto a bourgeois society of social representation that takes place under the figurehead of equality of opportunity. And what's key for Marx here is that Marx focuses on the idea of the commodity fetish. And essentially, and I think this is sometimes underappreciated, Marx essentially says that there are two types or two modes of fetishism. We have the fetishism of social relations as it exists in a feudal society. For example, if you go to the French court, I'll mention again Stefan Zweig's Marie Antoinette, which actually has some beautiful historical renditions of all the etiquette that exists at the court. The etiquette is a system, it's a system of fetishes in which completely, to our mind at least, bizarre social practices are supposed to indicate social status and worth. And what Stefan Zweig points out quite well is that this fetish of social relations also dominates the king, that he himself, if you will, is a slave to the fetish of social relations. In fact, at the exact moment that the king wants to escape his palace, when he wants to escape Paris to flee outside the borders of France, one thing that prevents him from doing this is that every night when the king goes to sleep, etiquette demands that he wear a little string around his pinky finger, which is attached to a personal aide or a page, who has to sit outside his bedchamber. And if the king stirs at night, if he moves, then this string will essentially wake up the page who knows that the king requires his assistance. Of course, it's very difficult for the king to make a nighttime escape if his every movement will be registered by a page who's watching over him. Once again, the most powerful man in the world, as Stefan Zweig points out, the irony, of course, the most powerful man in the world doesn't have the power to sneak out of his own bedchambers in the middle of the night. And these forms of etiquette, these forms of social relations, govern the entire hierarchy of existence. In other words, it's an honor for the king to wear a piece of string around his pinky finger because it signals how powerful he is and how he requires perpetual attention. And what happens within, for Marx, of course, within the transition from the aristocracy to bourgeois society, or feudal system into capitalism eventually, is that the fetish of social relations, in other words, the fetish of hierarchy and etiquette, in which everything that you wear and say and do becomes a marker of your position in the social system, that this is retained, but with one key difference. It's retained, but it's repressed. And how is it repressed? Well, it's no longer simply a marker of your naturally born, given to you by birth stature in the world. Instead, it becomes expressed through the commodity fetish. Let me give you a quick example. If in the during the French monarchy, for example, if a peasant somehow deigned to wear the livery of an aristocrat and to show up at court wearing his clothes, he would be immediately executed as soon as he was exposed. Whereas under capitalism, to bring it in today's age, anybody could buy expensive clothing. Like, as long as you have the money for it, anybody can go out and buy extremely expensive luxury goods. This is the whole quote-unquote democratizing premise of luxury and consumer goods, is that you too could smell like Madonna, or that you too could have the Louis Vuitton bag that Pharrell takes to his, I don't know, gym or whatever you will. That luxury products therefore give us the illusion of equal participation within the consumer markets and the identity of consumers, therefore being tied to the idea of our self-liberation and worth. In fact, if you want to take the L'Oreal slogan literally, the L'Oreal slogan being, because you're worth it, this is the essence of the promise of bourgeois ideology, which is to say that you too can dress and live like kings because you are worth it. There's nothing that makes you less worthy than the king. And so Marx is, in a sense, if you will, optimistic about the transition from aristocracy to a bourgeois society, because now the system of social relations no longer apparently seem to be there. If you have money, you are able to live as anybody else lives with money. It's not something that you have that is given to you simply by means of your stature and birth. Of course, let's be very clear, there are many ways in which this continues today when it comes to inheritance tax and nepo babies, etc. I'm not implying that this is actually how the world works. In fact, neither is Marx, for that matter. Marx's argument is that the system of domination therefore moves from a social fetish, namely bowing down to the king and being like the king, etc. It moves from this world of etiquette and social relations into the relations between things, into the commodity fetish. That therefore the commodity fetish, which promises you equality by means of having equal consumer access to luxury goods, fundamentally belies the fact that underneath the surface, if you will, the very same system of social oppression and hierarchy is perpetuated and continues. One moment, I'll interrupt the live stream. Are you guys okay?
Yeah, I think we're gonna go outside real quick.
Okay, I think Jenny is going to take the dogs out for a quick walk, so you might hear some doggies in the background. Is it okay if I don't come on the walk?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I appreciate you. Now, here I want to take a moment to very briefly specify what Marx actually means by bourgeois ideology. because I think this is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and it might help to briefly clarify what it means. So let's start with the word ideology. What does ideology mean? On a very basic level, ideology can be broken down into two words: idea and logos. And logos is essentially a system of meaning. An idea is the notion of essence, of what something is. In other words, to put it very simply, ideology is the system of, if you will, meaning that imposes necessity upon the world. Let me give you a very easy example. Let's say that you go into the kitchen. There's a reason why in your kitchen you keep your cutlery in the drawer, because it makes sense. Because if you're going to be preparing food in the kitchen, you want to have cutlery near at hand. This is not ideological. However, as soon as there's a distinction between, do you have silverware or do you have plasticware? Do you have aluminum ware? What type of brand of kitchen countertop do you have? Or do you have a gas or an electric stove, which of course has now become also a political battle, a nonsensical one to my mind. Here we enter the realm of ideology, namely the system of meaning, invisible almost, that governs the way in which we attribute and interpret the value of things. In other words, the value of things not simply inherently related to their use function, but related to their use value. And this is why, for example, you could take a cotton t-shirt and put a Balenciaga logo on it, and it suddenly becomes $500 instead of $2. Strictly speaking, there's no difference between the cotton t-shirt and the Balenciaga t-shirt, other than the signifier of status and wealth that comes with the logo. But Marx is not naive. Marx knows that it's not enough to say, well, they're both just cotton shirts. Marx's observation about the commodity fetish, and I want to be very clear here, is that this magical power, if you will, that the logo has over people is precisely the important part. It's not to just trivialize it to say, well, it's just the Balenciaga logo. Instead, what Marx is interested in is, how is it possible, not just that what people would spend so much money, if Marx had known about Balenciaga, how is it possible that an entire system of social relations and of domination and of status and value revolves around what are therefore essentially empty signifiers, mere logos? The use value, therefore, is something that is no longer considered. However, I will, for those of you who will critique me about not knowing my Marx, what's important here is that bourgeois ideology precisely emphasizes the use value. But I will get back to this. I don't want to make it too complicated. We'll get back to this, I promise. The point being is that what Marx calls bourgeois ideology is the system of meaning that creates the idea of innate or supposedly natural value for objects and commodities that therefore reflect the supposedly natural or innate characteristics of social characteristics and social value. In other words, bourgeois ideology suggests that to be a good person is to be a hard-working person. To be a good person is to be a valuable person. To be a good person is to be somebody who puts food and money on the table. To be a good person is someone who knows what brands to buy, what, for example, taste and having good taste becomes a fundamental category of bourgeois ideology. In fact, if you think about it, and this is something that Adorno and Horkheimer famously talked about in Enlightenment as Mass Deception, which also is part of the critique of the culture industry, is that the function of taste and education for the individual, quote-unquote, liberated subject, therefore becomes to essentially educate themselves as to what is considered tasteful. And rather than having a lot of different things, we simply have the reproduction of the same things. One of the key characteristics or symptoms of quote-unquote bourgeois society is that everything comes to look and taste and feel the same. That fundamentally, every consumer identifies as being a true individual by means of their purchasing power, and yet the system of reproduction by which commodities are created serve to create more and more genetic objects of consumption that provide less and less opportunity for individual expression, or, if you will, the critique of the very system through which these things are produced. Think about, for example, this is the main object of critique for Adorno and Horkheimer, Hollywood, how Hollywood produces many movies that are fundamentally the same. I love a Marvel movie as much as the next person, and yet fundamentally, Marvel movies are the epitome of this argument about bourgeois ideology. They essentially serve to reinforce a kind of black and white narrative about good versus evil through the perpetuation of stereotypes in the image of hero figures that is then regurgitated over and over in numerous installments, where every trailer functions, or every movie functions as a trailer for the next. The very idea of a television series, even successful, especially successful ones, and many of these I like Friends or The Office, etc., is to essentially reproduce one idea over and over and over again in infinite small variations. Hence, when you watch an episode of The Office or Friends, what you want is comfort. You want to be given something that essentially reaffirms and soothes your sense of order in the world. That audiences therefore being the contemporary version of the media consumer body, audiences want something predictable. They want something safe. They want something that won't challenge them or make them challenge the conditions in which they're interpreting and understanding and receiving media. That fundamentally the bar is lowered for all consumption and participation. And this is, for example, where you can see bourgeois ideology is with the iPad. The iPad was marketed as being or all Macs, but especially the iPad, was marketed as being a tool for individual creation and liberation, that you could express your creativity by means of using the iPad. That it was a key object, an almost totemic object, if you will, of the Enlightenment. That through the iPad, the realization of civilization would come to pass and everyone would be able to become a free, autonomous, educated, enlightened individual. Whereas the iPad fundamentally functions as a source of consumption, that you can access online stores more easily, that you can watch videos or stream on the go. And none of these things are inherently bad or innately bad. It's not a normative critique. It's that the very way in which you become a passive consumer of ideology is sold to you as being something which is the token of your liberation. And this is the most easy, distinct way to characterize or define Marx's idea of bourgeois ideology, which is your very subservience is sold to you as your own individual freedom. That the more you are told you are free, you are in fact complying to a system that does not allow and does not tolerate deviations from the norm. And this is something you can even find in Nietzsche, where Nietzsche has a great aphorism where he says that the easiest way to keep a man a slave is to convince him that he is free. Now, if you go back to Marx's analysis of feudalism or aristocracy versus the bourgeoisie, aristocratic ideology, if that even exists, we can talk about that another time, it's different, and bourgeois ideology. Therefore, we go from the subject who is a slave to the existence and the domination of social relations towards the subject who remains a slave, except his slavery now comes to him in the very guise of his own liberation and freedom. And now you can begin to understand why Marx would say that the royalists were precisely the ones who continued the revolution, and yet the revolution then installed royalism in disguise. Namely, the bourgeoisie simply became the new aristocracy. And yet, in order to uphold and legitimize their power, which could now no longer rest on the idea of a divine higher authority, which necessitated a king, now this process of social domination had to be repressed or obscured in its perceived opposite, in its antithesis, namely in the very freedom and liberation of the revolutionary subjects. And for Marx, the symptom, which is therefore that which emerges through this repression, is precisely the adherence to the commodity fetish. That man realizing that he is not truly free or autonomous to act in a manner in which he deems, therefore has as his only recourse to participate in the system of the commodity fetish. In other words, realizing that the subject is not free or not truly free, he finds recourse in consumption to prove to himself that he is liberated. And this is what Marx calls alienation. Alienation is, for example, similar to what today we would call retail therapy. This idea that you live a life that feels somehow hollow from within, in which you feel like you're simply living through the week, trying to get to the weekend, and yet the way in which you make it worthwhile is that you enjoy buying more and new things. If you think about the United States, for example, nothing comes to mind more as an emblem of alienation than the fact that the United States has more storage units per person than anywhere else in the world. That people essentially buy an enormous amount of consumer goods, many of which they don't even use, but they put away somewhere, and they pay rent to keep them there so that they can feel like they are free, like they could go motor skiing or whatever you call it, motor jet boating something, if they so wanted to. Now, it's important to note here that this is not meant to be a critique of people's spending habits. This itself would be part of bourgeois ideology, to say that people remain poor because they don't know how to spend their money. Instead, what Marx is pointing out is that the system of social domination, namely that of the royalists of a feudal system, is repressed within a capitalist system of social relations in which everyone participates freely and of their own volition. In fact, Marx's most famous expression about ideology is perhaps for they know not what they do. They participate, for they know not what they do. It's itself a biblical reference, of course. And this is where Sloterdijk, Peter Sloterdijk, has his own cynical or analysis of cynicism, which is that in contemporary consumer society, people participate knowingly. They know exactly what they're doing, and yet they continue to do it anyway. That fundamentally, we therefore lose the ability to articulate what it means to be free, what it means to have a life that is fulfilling. Now, before we talk a little bit about what makes life fulfilling, which I think is an interesting topic in its own right, on which I would like to conclude this lecture, I think it's important here to actually come up with a couple of examples that can help you if we relate it back to the idea of the master signifier. Now, remember that I said within the feudal society, the king and the monarchy function as the master signifier. In other words, the master signifier, the position of the king, essentially lent the veneer of legitimacy to the entire system of repression. That the king embodied the very social system of domination. And that therefore even the liberation from feudalism and the emergence of a national assembly and what would become the revolution was something that had to take place with the king present, with the king at the courts. And what's interesting here is that Lacan, in his writing, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, in his writing about the master signifier, actually quotes quite famously Racine, another French author and poet, who writes, "I fear God, so I have no other fears." In other words, the master signifier is the fear or the existence of the thing which is absolute, which therefore takes away all the considerations of the particular. For example, if God functions as the ultimate master signifier, and if your fear of God is absolute, then paradoxically, you don't have to fear anything else. Everything else becomes something that doesn't terrify you because God is what terrifies you the most. Fundamentally, the same is true for the king, is that nothing is impossible as long as the king is there. This is the crucial paradox that lies at the heart of the French Revolution, which is that it wasn't simply that the revolution was a revolt against the king. It's that it was a social and political project that took place under the auspices of royalty itself. That the argument of the Republicans was therefore that the liberation of man was the fulfillment, historically, of the necessity of monarchy. In other words, that the monarch wasn't simply someone who had to be replaced by another entity or power, but that the monarch's historical purpose was to guarantee the self-liberation of the French people and therefore to fade out of existence. Here we can find a similarity with the concept of the vanishing mediator, which I've talked about before. The vanishing mediator is a concept from Frederick Jameson, who himself bases it upon the works of Max Weber and the Protestant Spirit in Capitalism, his most famous work. And the vanishing mediator, in technical terms, is something which, and this is very technical, so I will give you examples. The vanishing mediator is that which becomes universalized in its perceived antithesis. This is exactly what happened in the French Revolution, is that the French Revolution wasn't simply supposed to be the opposite of the monarchy. The French Revolution was supposed to be the continuation of the ideal of the monarchy, that the monarch was therefore the guarantor of the virtue of the people, and that the historical necessity of the monarch was to guarantee the self-liberation of the people. Therefore, according to the logic of the royalist factions working with the Republicans, the monarch had to legitimize the revolution so that the revolution could make the monarch obsolete and therefore stand as his lasting and enduring triumph. Now the revolution is no longer the antithesis or the opposite to the rule of the king, but in a paradoxical way, his highest accomplishment. Now, Marx's argument relates to this as well. Marx, of course, being a scholar of Hegel, and all of this goes back to Hegelian theory. Marx's argument is therefore that bourgeois society, rather than being the antithesis to the feudal system and the monarchy, is rather its continuation in another form. That the very principles and dynamics of the fetish, of the oppression of people, is continued into capitalism and yet sold back to people as being the liberation, the liberation from oppression. And so once again, we have the vanishing mediator. It's not that the revolution or bourgeois ideology is simply the antithesis to aristocratic or feudal rule, is that it is its continuation under another name. And that in the exact moment in which the principle of social domination became universalized, i.e. democratized into revolution, the king, the position of king, faded away. Not because he had been superseded or usurped, but because his very principle of total social control had now been universalized into a people that controlled itself under the name of freedom. It's a very dark theory of history, if you will. This is what Hegel has in mind when he talks about the cunning of reason, or die List der Vernunft. And quick plug here, I wrote an ebook about Hegel's concept of the cunning of reason, which you can find on Patreon. Now, I actually saw a great example of this in a television series that I was watching on Netflix. It's a French documentary series about the heiress of the L'Oreal I guess like skincare company, or I don't know, luxury pharmaceutics, etc., something like this. And there's a beautiful, let me lay it out for you. Essentially, we have here the richest, the wealthiest woman in the world who has her own court in Paris. She has courtesans, she has assistants, she has butlers, maids, etc. She essentially is like living like a king in Paris. And at a certain point, someone shows up at the court who is considered not worthy of her court. And this is a young man known, well, not that young, known as Bernier. He becomes her lover. And this is a man who doesn't care about the court of this bourgeois heiress. He pees in the roses and he's rude to the staff and he doesn't believe in the idea of hierarchy. And so, of course, she falls madly in love with him. And she gives him many gifts. Gifts, in fact, that are so ludicrous that, believe it or not, the gifts that she ends up giving him value up to $1 billion over 20 years. Now, at this point, one of the butlers, who decides that he wants to protect his employer, he wants to protect this bourgeois queen, he decides to secretly record her conversations. The butler starts recording every conversation that his employer has. And here we have again the cunning of reason, the way in which history functions according to Hegel. The butler believes that he is protecting the court of this very wealthy woman, that he is protecting her from this man who is seeking to steal his wealth. And yet, of course, no surprise, all the things he ends up recording end up becoming the ways in which her company is avoiding tax around the world. In fact, how the entire corporation is fundamentally fraudulent and is paying money to the Sarkozy government to help him get elected. And so the very gesture of the butler, which was meant to protect the integrity of this bourgeois court against this outsider, is the very thing that brings about its downfall. Once again, the Hegelian idea of the cunning of reason, that history doesn't move forward in terms of the linear development of a gradual ascension or decline, but it's precisely the attempt to preserve this court that brings about its decline. Or Marx's analysis of the French Revolution being once again distinctly Hegelian, that it's precisely the royalists who bring about the end of the monarchy as we know it. And paradoxically, that this end of the monarchy becomes the universalization of the principles of social domination through its supposed antithesis, namely bourgeois ideology. And I think this is something that's actually easy to overlook when we study history. We think of history often as being a pendulum that swings in two directions. But this is not a Hegelian image at all. It's a very centrist notion that the deviations to the left and to the right, to put it in contemporary terms, are mere excesses that will lead us to a kind of central mean in which the good is sustained. Itself, once again, a key aspect of bourgeois ideology. This notion that left and right, quote unquote, deviations are ideologically suspicious and had to find themselves in the reasonable center position that allows and guarantees the consensual functioning of the marketplace. In fact, the marketplace, and this is the key argument we've been leading up to, within bourgeois ideology, the marketplace becomes the master signifier that takes the place of the king. That the king fades away, that the idea of a person who represents divine will becomes historically no longer necessary, because now the system of social domination and reproduction can be found much more efficiently in a new master signifier, namely the master signifier of the market. The market, which supposedly guarantees the innately natural and legitimized necessity of the social order. And that is what for Marx bourgeois ideology is fundamentally. It's the suggestion that the market becomes the king. And of course, vice versa, that the consumer and the participant within said market is king. If you've heard the expression customer is king, you've literally heard the contemporary ideological equivalent of Marx's analysis of the French Revolution and the transition from a feudal to a capitalist society, namely the repression of the existing system of social domination into its supposed antithesis. The customer is king means the market is king, means the social system of feudal domination has been transposed into a conveniently subservient, non-existent, ethereal master signifier of the idea of the market. That therefore, politicians are supposed to guarantee the functioning of the market. That the stock market is supposed to give you an indication as to whether or not a country is thriving or a politician is a good representative. That to guarantee the rights of property holders and business owners so that the market can be appeased, that becomes the new master signifier around which social relations of domination are continued that were once openly flouted under the feudal system. And what's important here is that fundamentally, this Marxist analysis is therefore not a simplified notion of it's the poors versus the rich, or there's more poor people than rich people, and once they realize that they'll be able to take over. Is that Marx's analysis is essentially and fundamentally a historical one, a Hegelian one, about how history functions not as a pendulum, but as a progression of a system of social domination that finds its reiteration under new and recurrent social circumstances, what Adorno later would call historical constellations. And that these may differ over time, but that fundamentally they work according to the same structural principles and mechanisms. Hence why, for Marx, his theory of revolution, which is therefore his theory of history, was a science. Marxism as a science, namely, not simply the engagement with the content of history, but the supposedly logical deduction of the structural principles and mechanism of history itself, none of which would have been possible without Hegel. Now, I wanted to end here on two things. I wanted to end on David Fincher's movie, The Killer, which we may have to do in the bonus discussion, which I host for patrons after this session. We host a live Q&A for all of our patrons after every lecture, which I also post as a podcast for patrons. But I do want to end on a slightly more optimistic note. Namely, how is it possible to create? How is it possible to live freely and happily if the very notion of freedom has fundamentally become that which enslaves us? Now, there's at least two ways to answer this question. First, understanding how this works, enjoying and benefiting from reading philosophy and theory is the first way in which you liberate yourself. That fundamentally, once you start understanding these historical processes, you have already taken the fundamental step towards self-liberation. And of course, paradoxically, self-liberation is therefore not waking up. Self-liberation is becoming skeptical and suspicious of the very idea of being told that you are waking up, that you are free. Learning to see through the illusion of freedom is therefore the key component of becoming free. Secondly, in order to live in a way that is free, it's important to not identify purely by means of what you buy, what you consume, what you express to others. That to live your life simply trying to signal happiness, reproduce happiness, is precisely the thing that contributes to alienation. One of the fundamental insights and characteristics about all life is that the easiest way to be happy is to help other people. The easiest way to be happy is to be there for other people. The easiest way to be happy is to have solidarity with other people. That the idea that we act only for ourselves, that we're all individual, rational-minded people in a kind of perpetual rat race, looking to gain some competitive advantage of each other, is precisely not natural. It's not human. That's what serves the reproduction of the machine, if you will. To help other people in whatever way you see fit is what therefore allows for the reproduction of your own individual subjectivity. It's a paradox that goes all the way back to antiquity, that paradoxically we become free subjects when we become subject to another. We become subject to another when we love another. We become subject to another when we care and help for another. We become subject for another when we teach and educate each other. Fundamentally, this is how you liberate yourself. It's by realizing that you become most yourself when you become subject to other people. And one of the myths and illusions, which you can call alienation, or you can simply call, I don't know, the symptom of contemporary life, is that we lose the capacity to connect with other people. And of course, in what Marx would find a historical irony, we lose this capacity precisely because we use social media tools that tell us that this is how we connect with others. What people like Mark Zuckerberg are able to do is simply the perpetuation of the next stage of bourgeois ideology, which is to say, you are more free because now you can speak to everyone. You are more human because now you can have lots of followers. You are more happy because you can post pictures of it online. Essentially, once again, your freedom is proffered to you under the auspices of that which binds you. And of course, what creates value today? What is the new commodity fetish? It's no longer the material world, it's the digital world. By means of giving your attention, you are creating value for capitalists like Mark Zuckerberg. The longer you are glued to the innate reproduction of similar images on TikTok, the more you generate value for the advertisers. Let me be very clear. When I post a video to TikTok or YouTube, I am in a licensing agreement with that company so that they can sell ads against my video. That too is a symptom of contemporary life, that the very platforms that allow for the free expression and self-education are nevertheless subject to the structural principles by which more and further market value and capitalization is generated for a select few. And this, we are then told, is what makes us free. We are free because we can post to YouTube. We are free because we can post on Instagram. But that is not freedom. We are not free because we can create value for corporations. We are free because we can create value for each other. And that is not the kind of value that you can put into a corporate spreadsheet. That is the value of being there for people when they need you most. That is the value of doing something inconvenient because it helps somebody else. It's the value of being able to be there for someone when you can make no difference in their life other than to be there. Those are the things we do for each other. Those are the things that cannot be quantified. And so fundamentally, if you want to live a free life, you have to begin to understand how your very freedom and the way in which it is defined is the key site of ideological contestation. The more you are told you are free, the more likely that you are enslaved. And being able to start understanding that is the starting point of all liberation. Thank you so much for watching today. I will see you next week. And if you'd like to become a patron, go to www.patreon.com/JulianPhilosophy.